I routinely get sent video clips of police doing things wrong, or allegedly doing things wrong, as well as other members of the public. And this clip is no different. So let's take a look at this clip, and then we're going to have a bit of discussion about it.
Are you in charge of a motor vehicle there on your mobile phone, officer?
Well, we parked to the...
Yeah, but the ignition's on, innit?
Brakes on.
Pardon?
And brakes on.
Yeah, but you're also still in charge of a motor vehicle then, aren't you?
But I'm not driving.
It's you again, innit?
So quite clearly this chap is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, accusing the officers of breaking the law by being on his phone whilst in charge of the motor vehicle. Now the key terms here are important because he says that he's in charge of the vehicle. Now he's correct to say that he's in charge of the vehicle, especially if the engine is running, but is he driving the vehicle? Because that is the key legal question. Now, there's no absolutely definitive, concrete, watertight definition of driving in English and Welsh law. But there are various cases that have come close to defining it and give us some clues here. One such case is Edkins and Knowles of 1973. Long story short, and then I'll explain why I'm talking about it in a moment, is that this chap was driving home. He was followed home by plainclothes police officers who then asked him to wait there in his vehicle when he'd got home until a uniformed officer arrived. And when the uniformed officer arrived and was to explain to him that the other officers had followed him home and called them there because of his erratic and fast driving, the uniformed officer obviously wanted to take a breath specimen. Lo and behold, he was over the limit, he was arrested and taken to the police station for a further assessment by a laboratory test, which again, lo and behold, showed that he was over the limit to drive. And of course, he was charged with the relevant offence. However, the justices dismissed it on the basis that the uniformed officer had no power to take a breath test in the first place. This was obviously appealed, but the appeal was dismissed on the basis that the court decided that he was not driving at the time that the officer formed the suspicion that he might have been drinking whilst driving and therefore over the limit. Now, this came down to a question of fact as to whether this chap was driving at the requisite time. And the court obviously held that at that moment he was just sitting in his vehicle. He was not driving. Now, the question as relevant to this case with this police officer in this video I just showed you is, well, is the officer driving because he's at the side of the road but the engine is on? But he also said the handbrake is on. So this is a question of fact for the court to decide, to be clear. So in some scenarios, the court might decide that that person is driving. But in most cases, I would think, and I would certainly like to think that police would have certain discretion to think that someone is not driving. If they've pulled over to the side of the road, the handbrake is on if they are doing that to take a phone call, even if the engine is running. Now, strictly speaking, the engine should be off. That would be safer. But if the engine is running and you're at the side of the road, now also bearing in mind that Rule 270 of the Highway Code provides that you must not stop on the carriageway, hard shoulder, slip road, central reservation or verge except in an emergency or when told to do so by the police, an emergency sign or flashing by red signal lights. And it also clarifies do not stop on the hard shoulder to either make or receive mobile phone calls. However, if in the ordinary sense of the word you are parked up at the side of a road legally, even if the engine is still running, it then falls to a question of fact for the court to decide as to whether or not you were driving at that moment in time. Because if you are driving and using your mobile phone, obviously that is the standard mobile phone offence as in Regulation 110, which is anything from illuminating the screen onwards. So anything that you're doing with the mobile phone. Now also don't confuse this scenario with being stationary in traffic at traffic lights or waiting to turn left or right or in any of those kind of scenarios. Those scenarios you are definitively driving, even if in those scenarios you are stationary with the handbrake on and the engine running. Even if, frankly, the engine is off, because you might have one of those vehicles where the engine cuts off if it's been running long enough and it's one of these stop-start engines to conserve fuel. Even then, if your engine has switched itself off, if you're in stationary traffic, the court is virtually certainly going to find that you were still driving at that point in time. As I say, there is always a question for the court here. But I would like to think, as I say, that there'll be a degree of common sense that if you are parked up at the side of the road and that's the reason you did it, not that you can rely on this video as legal advice because it's a generic explanation, but you could, in all seriousness, use this same argument that you pulled over to the side of the road. Although the engine was on, the handbrake was on, and you did that so that you were not driving anymore and you were parked to take the phone call. Why might you leave the engine running? Well, you might leave the engine running to keep yourself warm in the vehicle. Now, you'll see lots of different websites say that you should turn the engine off and that you are still driving if the engine is running, but it is still a question for the court to decide whether or not you're driving. So obviously, it's better that you turn the engine off, but I would like to think that officers would use some common sense and not prosecute somebody for that offence. If you've pulled over to the side of the road, your handbrake is on, and you are quite clearly in everyone's mind parked, even if the engine's running. So this is one of those scenarios that is not absolutely clear-cut, but in most scenarios, it should be relatively simple. I would think that a court would think that it's a waste of time if someone's prosecuted for this offence and they say to the court, in all seriousness, I pulled over to the side of the road sensibly to take the phone call, so as not to do it while I'm driving, because obviously, I wouldn't do that while I'm driving. So I pulled over to the side of the road, I put the handbrake on, and then took the call where it was safe to do so. Just so happens that the engine was still running. Now, as I say, you'll find various websites tell you that you have to turn the engine off and you're still driving otherwise. But if we apply the case that I've talked about in this scenario, if you've either reached the destination or you've stopped the car and you've done the things associated with stopping the car and reaching your destination, such as putting on the handbrake, there's quite a clear argument that you are not driving anymore. So I hope you found that interesting. Please do hit the like button and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.